Good evening. I'm Andrea Weinstein, Senior Director of Academic Development, and in part, I oversee the libraries. Thank you very, very much for coming this evening, and we're thrilled to have Susie Linfield with us this evening. Over dinner, we were talking, and I know that I read a review of her book in The Guardian, it's what first excited me about having her here. The next Neely series is not until February 23rd. Roger Easton and Keith Knox will talk about 10 years of imaging between and through the lines of the Archimedes palimpsest. This is an interesting piece. It's made a lot of national news lately, and that there was a manuscript by Archimedes that was erased, basically, and then written over by some monks with, I think, probably a religious tract. They've now gone back and through a series of different universities and different scientists and researchers gone back to make evident the original text. So it should be, these are two of the scientists who worked on this particular project, so it should be very interesting. Tonight, Joan Saab, who's Associate Professor of Art and Art History and Director of the Visual and Cultural Studies program, of which I'm a graduate, is here to do the formal introduction for Susie Linfield. Thanks, Joan.
Good evening. I'm extremely excited to do this. I'm just going to begin with some questions from the preface to the book that you can all take home with you, if you'd like, by Susie Linfield. She asks, what does it mean to look at photographs of violence and suffering? Is the refusal to do so a form of respect? Why are such photographs tarred as voyeuristic, exploitative, and pornographic? What would solidarity with the people in such photographs mean? How would we understand the world if there were no photographs? And why do some thinkers believe that an imageless world would be a better one? What does it mean to acknowledge another's suffering, knowing full well that to embrace it is impossible? And how has the photography of political trauma and political witness responded to the radical changes in how war is made and what it is made for in the course of the past 8 decades? These are not small questions, but they're very important ones to think about and to ask. Susie Linfield is the Director of Cultural Reporting and Director of the Cultural Reporting and Criticism Program at New York University. She writes about culture and politics for a variety of publications, including the Washington Post Book World, the Boston Review, Dissent, The Nation, Guernica, The Forward, and The New Humanist. Her work has also appeared in the New York Times, The Village Voice, the Los Angeles Times, Newsday, The New Yorker, Rolling Stone, and Dance, Inc. Linfield was formerly the arts editor of the Washington Post, the deputy editor of the Village Voice, the editor-in-chief of American Film, and a critic for the Los Angeles Times Book Review. She's taught in the Cultural Reporting and Criticism program at NYU since it began in 1995. Her book, The Cruel Radiance, Photography and Political Violence, is, as I said, an important book and raises questions not just about what it means to look, but why people don't. I'm just going to read you a sampling of the many reviews of this book. A brilliant, lucid, and incisive exploration of photography and political violence, begins one. This is a magnificent book, begins another. Beautifully crafted, exquisitely written, and exceptionally powerful in its arguments, says the Design Observer. And finally, this is not finally, there are many, many more positive reviews of this book. A profoundly thoughtful account of the role of photojournalism in an irremediately violent world. Linfield's book is as much about conscience and empathy as it is about photography. And I hope you'll talk about that in a few minutes. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Susie Linfield.
Thank you very much. Thank you for that kind introduction. Thank you for inviting me here. It's especially nice to be at the home of Eastman Kodak, one of the pillars of photography in the 20th century. I'm going to read a bit from some sections of chapter 2 of my book, which, can everyone hear me? which focuses specifically on photography and human rights. But I'm also going to update my comments with reference to current political events, especially in the Mideast with the so-called Arab Spring that we've been witnessing. I'm sure many of you are familiar with Walter Benjamin's famous statement, quote, "There is no document of civilization which is not at the same time a document of barbarism," end quote. When it comes to photography, the opposite is also true. Every image of barbarism, of immiseration, humiliation, terror, extermination, embraces its opposite, though sometimes unknowingly. Every image of suffering says not only this is so, but also by implication, this must not be. Not only this goes on, but also by implication, this must stop. Documents of suffering are documents of protest. They show us what happens when we unmake the world. That is the dialectic and the hope at the heart of the photograph of suffering. But lodged within that dialectic and hope is a complicating, devastating paradox. There is no doubt, despite the claims of critics such as Bertolt Brecht and Susan Sontag, that photography has, more than any other 20th century medium, protested violence to billions of people all over the globe. Yet the history of photography also shows just how limited, how inadequate such protests are. Seeing does not necessarily translate into believing, understanding, caring, or acting. That is the dialectic and the failure at the heart of the photograph of suffering. And this is a picture, which actually is in my book, taken by a Danish photographer named Ulrik Jansen at a Bangladeshi hospital that treats women who have been assaulted by their husbands or would-be suitors for crimes such as asking for a divorce or refusing marriage. Usually their faces are scarred with acid. What then is photography's role in revealing injustice, fighting exploitation, and furthering human rights? Photojournalists have been key creators and disseminators of what the historian Samuel Moyn called, quote, "the spectacle of blood fastened on extravagant bodily violation and pain," end quote. What, if anything, is there to show for this century-long spectacle of grim images? And why is there, especially in the present moment, such a backlash against these photographs? But first, another question. Why are photographs so good at making us see cruelty? Partly, I think, because photographs bring home to us the reality of physical suffering with a literalness and an irrefutability that neither literature nor painting can claim. The Uruguayan essayist Eduardo Galeano observed, after viewing a photograph by Sebastião Salgado, quote, "Hunger looks like the man that hunger is killing." The very thing that critics have assailed photographs for not doing, explaining causation, history, political contradictions, is connected to the very thing they do so well, present us to ourselves and each other as bodily creatures. Photographs reveal how the human body is the original site of reality, in Elaine Scarry's words. The body is our primary truth, our inescapable fate. Which is precisely what Jean Amoret learned to his never-ending amazement when he faced his Gestapo torturers. All those attributes that a man might think of as, quote, his soul or his mind or his consciousness or his identity are destroyed when there is that cracking and splintering in the shoulder joints, Amoret later wrote. Torture, and later Auschwitz, taught Amoret, a proud intellectual, just how real his body was. Photographs show us how easily we are reduced to the merely physical, which is to say how easily the body can be maimed, starved, splintered, beaten, burnt, torn, and crushed. Photographs present us, in short, with physical cruelty and our vulnerability to it. The vulnerability is something that every human being shares. The cruelty is something that shatters our very sense of what it means to be human. As the Iraqi human rights activist Kanan Makia wrote, quote, "The violation of the human body is the bedrock under all the layers of horrible things that human beings do to one another," end quote. But documentary photography's ability to confront us with powerful images of suffering, images that we do not, cannot always understand or master, has been the subject of vitriolic attacks from a range of critics. This can be traced back to the Weimar era, certainly one of modernity's most traumatic periods, and to some of the Weimar critics and artists, including Benjamin, Brecht, and Siegfried Krakauer. But it is particularly in the post-World War II period that photographs depicting violence and poverty, especially in the so-called Third World, have been denounced as patronizing, imperialist, and racist. Writing of the photograph of a starving Sudanese child, for instance, anthropologists Arthur and Joan Kleinman charged, quote, "The image of the subaltern conjures up an almost neo-colonial ideology of failure, inadequacy, passivity, fatalism, and inevitability," end quote. Many others have echoed such claims. In particular, the charge of pornography is freely bandied about when it comes to photographs of suffering. Susan Sontag, for instance, wrote, quote, "All images that display the violation of an attractive body are, to a certain degree, pornographic." Countless other critics have used this terminology. Pornographic photography has become a stock phrase with numerous iterations. Thus, war photography is casually described and dismissed as war porn, while in the humanitarian aid world, photographs of the poor and vulnerable are decried as development pornography. Jørgen Listner, a Danish humanitarian aid worker, summed up this outlook when he charged that the photograph of an African famine victim is a kind of social pornography because, quote, "It exposes something in human life that is as delicate and deeply personal as sexuality, that is, suffering," end quote. The use of the term pornography is not totally inapt, but in my view, it belies an essential confusion. Pornography strikes many viewers as a betrayal, not an expression of human sexuality. Pornography reveals something that strangers should not see and whose worth is diminished when they do. But photographs of suffering people, of the body in pain, are something quite different. They are the revelation of something that ought not exist. One can argue that sex should remain private. When it comes to torture, exploitation, and cruelty, however, privacy is an integral part of the problem. Nor is it obvious that a child starving to death is deeply personal and private, or rather only deeply personal and private, in the sense that making love usually is. On the contrary, famine, by definition, is a shared condition, as are many other kinds of misery and grief. War, we might say, is the collectivization of anguish. What is wrong with revealing such suffering? What is right with hiding it? Why is the teller rather than the tale considered obscene? And in any case, aren't some of the world's obscenities worthy of our attention? Indeed, the word pornographic is now so widely and variously, dare I say promiscuously, summoned in discussions of documentary photography that it is not at all clear how it can be a key to deeper understandings. I would argue that pornography, like the term Orientalism, is now used primarily as a weapon whose main job is to shame the accused and to stifle further discussion. Ironically, those photographers who have worked hardest and most consciously to avoid objectifying their subjects are fiercely derided as pornographers and exploiters. James Nachtwey, perhaps the most prominent and controversial war photographer working today, is a prime target of such attacks. This is a picture that Nachtwey took at a feeding station in the Sudan during the famine of 1993 there. Also attacked is Sebastião Salgado, the Brazilian photographer and former Marxist economist. He has spent decades documenting the Third World's peasants, manual workers, refugees, famine victims, and displaced people, the losers in globalization's great game, as journalist David Reef put it. Salgado's subjects work on stony farms and jungle plantations, on ships and railroads, in factories, on oil rigs, in diamond and coal mines. Most of them are inconceivably poor. Yet Salgado imbues his subjects with cynicism. It confuses moral weight with aesthetic clumsiness, and it is more concerned with the clear conscience of the viewer than with the plight of the injured subject. This animus against looking has thrust contemporary photojournalists into a catch-22. Some are criticized for taking too beautiful pictures, and so the important question when we think about photography and human rights is not how many images we see or how brutal or explicit or pornographic they are. The real issue is how we use these images. Can they help us to make meaning of the present and the past? If so, what meanings do we make, and how do we act upon them? The ultimate answers to such questions reside not in the pictures, but in ourselves. Photojournalists are responsible for the ethics of showing, but we are responsible for the ethics of seeing. This requires transforming our relationship to photographs from one of passivity, complaint, and cynicism to one of creativity and collaboration. And it means regarding the violators of human rights, not the photographers who document them, as the real agents of exploitation and death. Roland Bard, another critic, described photographers as agents of death. It may be as hard for us to understand our new chaotic visual environment as it was for Weimar critics and citizens to master theirs. Images flood into our world in the old ways, through the printed press, films, and television, but also through cell phones, iPods, satellite dishes, social networking sites, and the internet. How to respond? Anxieties abound, and for good reason. On the internet, all photographs are equal, including doctored, manipulated, or constructed photographs, and those without any meaningful or with entirely false contexts. Thus, the critic Andy Grunberg has warned that, quote, the liberty of an unchecked image environment may prove to be less a blessing than a subtle form of tyranny, and the democracy of the camera may prove to be a perverse kind of fascism, end quote. Certainly, the new visual technologies have changed the relationship between information, propaganda, and war. The Taliban, for instance, which used to ban photographs, movies, and television as ungodly, now has its own video production unit, which posts its advertisements for jihad, its videos of suicide bombings and beheadings on the web. So does Al-Qaeda. Yet, as Gilles Perez and many others have argued, digital photography and the internet also herald unprecedented possibilities for new, more egalitarian forms of visual participation, and can be a boon to human rights activists everywhere. The inspiring and sometimes bloody photographs we saw from the 2009 Iranian protests, and more recently from Tunisia and Egypt and Syria and Yemen, lend credence to this optimistic pro-democracy interpretation of the new media. Many of those photographs, especially from Iran and Syria, were taken by non-professionals on their cell phones, then quickly circulated all over the world. One could and can find them everywhere, from major newspapers to Facebook. Yet the techno-utopianism that photographs from the Arab and Muslim uprisings have prompted. Some writers have hailed these movements as Twitter revolutions, YouTube revolutions, or Facebook revolutions. Strikes me as premature, if not vastly overblown. In Iran, it was the old-fashioned forces, the old-fashioned guns of the police, the Revolutionary Guards, and the army that determined the outcome, as they are doing today in Syria, and as they did, though to opposite effect, in Tunisia and Egypt. Indeed, the Iranian movement has launched into a painful self-critique of its reliance on the internet. After the failed call for a massive turnout in the so-called Trojan horse demonstration of last February, one Iranian blogger wondered, where were the Greens of Tehran? Then he answered, quote, on the internet reading about the Trojan horse plan, on YouTube learning about the action, or chatting online in the afternoon about where we should have met in the morning, end quote. And two can play the technology game. According to Human Rights Watch, the Iranian government has created an online surveillance center and is believed to be behind a cyber army of hackers that it can unleash against opponents. Indeed, the Ayatollah himself has a Facebook page. Yes, you too can friend the Ayatollah. Or for that matter, follow President Ahmadinejad's Twitter feed for timely updates from the dictator. In fact, since the 2009 revolt, Iran's courtrooms have hosted numerous show trials, its jails have filled with political prisoners, charges of rape and other state-sponsored tortures abound, and executions continue at an alarming rate. Twitter is not an adequate response to the power of the state. Social media, indeed any media, can never replace political parties, strategies, programs, or leadership. The new danger, I fear, is that information freedom will become synonymous with, that is, become a substitute for, real political and civic freedom. It might behoove us to remember that the medium isn't the message is the message. Iran taught us, and I suspect so will Tunisia and Egypt and Syria and Yemen, that democratic images can inspire a democracy and strengthen a democracy, but they cannot create a democracy. Only people working in solidarity with each other in the real world, not the virtual one, can do that. I'm going to end with briefly showing a few photos that are extremely recent. They're not in my book, and that make us think, or at least made me think, about what photographs can and cannot do in helping us to confront barbarism and suffering. I should warn you that these photographs are quite disgusting, and I thought for a long time about whether I should or should not show them. The first is a very controversial series of 4 pictures that were taken last year by a Somali photographer named Farah Abdi Warsema, who works for the AP. They show the stoning to death of a man named Mohammed Abukar Ibrahim in Somalia for the crime of adultery, the stoning carried out by a fundamentalist Muslim group called Hizbul Islam. Hizbul Islam has allied with the main Islamist militia in Somalia, Al-Shabaab, which essentially controls the country now. And I should say that Sharia law is now legal in Somalia, so what we're seeing here is not technically a crime. There are a lot of debates now about the reintroduction of Sharia into Afghanistan and various other places, which I think sometimes have a sort of abstract quality about them. So in thinking about Sharia, we might remember these pictures. The pictures are also very controversial because they obviously were taken, they could only have been taken with the approval of the militia that was carrying out the stoning. This is the beginning. This is the second picture. The victim at this point is buried, though still alive. And this is the last picture. You can also see some of his assailants smiling in victory. And the last picture I'm going to show was taken this year by a New Zealand photographer named Robin Hammond. He has been doing work in the DRC, the Democratic Republic of Congo, which is neither democratic nor a republic. Congo has now been designated the, quote, rape capital of the world by various humanitarian organizations. A recent study estimates that almost 2 million women and girls in the Congo have been raped in the course of the wars there. This picture shows a woman named Basamai. She had been raped. And after the rape, her assailant carved out her eyes so she would not ever be able to identify him. The war against women and girls, which actually is increasingly how war is waged now in the world, is, I think, something that is elided, not paid much attention to in the press and also in various debates about human rights, political intervention, et cetera. But it is perhaps something that warrants a bit of our attention. Thank you.